Welcome to Conversations in Data by Tech Accelerator, the podcast where we talk to the builders, the founders, and the data obsessives who are crafting how the world really understands information. I'm Clara, and today I'm hosting Ben Zweig, the CEO and co-founder of Revelio Labs, a workforce intelligence company that's building something really ambitious, a universal HR database from public data alone. Ben, great to have you and welcome.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll get started with, a little bit about your original story. You have a PhD in economics, you were doing workforce analytics at IBM, you were at a hedge fund, and then you went and started a company. What was the insight that made you think this has to exist and I am going to be the one building it?
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like a weird background, but I think it all kind of comes together. I, spent a bunch of years being really obsessed with finance, and there's this book called Capital Ideas by Peter Bernstein. Anyway, it's about the kind of the birth of finance as a science. So like in the 50s and early 60s, the field of finance was very like non-sophisticated. There was no data really. It was just a bunch of like ad hoc, thrifts doing lending based on nothing. It wasn't really rigorous. It wasn't scientific. And he's like a financial historian, also an economist, but kind of cataloged this history of what happened, which led to the world of like financial sophistication and rigor that we see today. And I remember just thinking like, wow, these are like larger than life characters. There's like Carrie Markowitz and Merton Miller and Mike Bloomberg, and all these like
Yeah.
characters that like are part of that story. And it was so cool. And then eventually I went to IBM in the corporate world. The first day I started, my manager at the time kind of introduced what we were doing. And he said, employees are 2/3 of our expenses at IBM, and we don't have any clue how to manage them. We are like completely in the dark. And coming from finance, I was like, obviously I know that labor markets are twice as big as capital markets. That's 2/3 of the economy, and capital is 1/3 of the economy. But I was just like, why are they so behind? Why is it so backward? And, I was like, someday someone's going to write a book like Capital Ideas, but it's going to be about how labor markets became scientific and rigorous and sophisticated. And I was like, I think I want to be one of the characters in that book. So that was really the birth of the idea for me. And then of course, like, how that led to unified data and scraping public sources and whatever, like that's like kind of downstream of this original spark of like wanting to advance the science.
That is extremely interesting and very random. It was something related to finance, and then you got into the labor part of it. And yes, it is so much. It is so meaningful. And now, talking a little bit more about what Revelio does, can you explain the core product to me? You're calling it a universal HR database, but every company's HR is in a locked box pretty much. So you've said it before. How do you actually reconstruct that from public sources?
Yeah. Okay. So I like the way you're framing it as like a reconstruction, because that's essentially what it is. Like you said, every company has their own HR data, but like they would never ever share that data. But like a lot of the information that's in an HR database is also mirrored in the public domain. So, on someone's resume or LinkedIn profile or whatever, like they have their job title, their company name, their start date, their end date, the description of what they do, the skills they have. There's so much information there that is also, it's just very rich information. And the nice thing about public sources is that you can analyze a company that you have no affiliation to. So when I was at IBM, like we would never in a million years dream that we could see the HR database at Oracle. Like they wouldn't share that, but like if we could at least approximate it, and at least get like hiring rates by roles or attrition rates by roles or skills or whatever it is, or seniority, whatever we want to do, then like that can get us pretty close. And when we started, we didn't really know like how close we could get. Like, could we actually measure the attrition rate of some role with precision? And like it was really hard. It still is really hard. But I think we're we've got a lot more validation now that works actually really nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a lot of work to get there, because I think another challenge that I didn't really address, but is kind of the core challenge, is actually kind of standardizing classifications of employees between organizations. So they use different titles, they have different levels of seniority, they have different like classifications for how they you know like their business units or their geos or whatever it is. So being able to kind of unify that requires like a lot of, kind of universal taxonomies.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question to you about, the primary data sources. But now that you said about LinkedIn and job posts, I do this every day and I realize there's just so much information out there in those, such as salary or location, like, oh, can you commute to Liverpool Street in London 3 times a week? And of course, online you can find so much more information about businesses than you could before. Like right now, if you want to look up a company in Europe, I think that you can even see their revenue, and that's just public information. And in the United States and everywhere, but like exact numbers, like to the cents, So that's very, very different from what HR really is because behind, companies' closed doors, there's still, the exact salaries, the exact titles, and how people change. But then people go and put that on LinkedIn. So it's, um it's very, very interesting.
It's really wild. Yeah, I mean, even now, like, and we've been doing this for like 7.5 years or so, and even now we're still discovering new data sets that are out there that we just didn't know about.
Yeah,
So
that's really fun.
yeah, and I like just trying to think of an example. Like, we found out that, there's in the US, there's these published layoff notices. They're called warn notices. And, that we've been collecting for a while, but we found out that in Europe, you can actually get notices of expansions, of planned expansions. And we were like,
Mm,
"Ooh, that's cool." Like, who knew? And added it to the feed. And we just found out that in China, when municipalities are hiring public sector employees, they have to, before they hire them, they have to like list out all their characteristics, their demographics, their experience. They list this all out. They publish it on their website so that, the local population has a chance to like, contest it or whatever. And we're just like, that's out there. Like, this is
that's insane.
crazy.
That is insane.
Yeah.
That is insane. Putting out the demographics, that is so problematic. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah. I mean, sure. But like, I think as data people, I'm like, all right, if it's out there, it's out there. Like, I'm gonna collect
I'll
it.
take it. I'll take it, but I just love random information and random data. Maybe that's why I'm here at Accelerator and Data Sharp, but yeah.
Cool. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at Accelerator, we talk to a lot of data buyers. And one thing that we hear constantly is that raw data is actually the easy part, right? It's the cleaning, monetizing, normalizing, enriching. That's a lot of work. What do you think about the data pipeline at Revelio?
Yeah, it's funny. Like when you start selling data to hedge funds, I think you get a lot of advice that's like sometimes good advice and sometimes bad advice. I think one thing we heard early on that turned out to be not good advice that thankfully we disregarded was that the sophisticated hedge funds just want the raw data and don't do any of the enrichment. They're going to want their own pipelines. They're going to want to fiddle with it and construct it any way they want. And we didn't think that was right. First of all, because like in this vision we were trying to build toward, where we wanted to like unify and centralize and standardize employment data for the world, for HR, for anyone analyzing employees. We knew that like hedge funds weren't the final end buyer, but even among hedge funds, I think I think it's just not true that they want to standardize themselves, return information, or like finding correlations between securities or like, constructing factors. Like that's their thing. They can do that. But if it's something like constructing a taxonomy of occupations, that is our thing. Like there's no way that like Two Sigma is going to be better at that than we are. That is like we are in the business of curating employment related data. So for employment specific metrics, like even inferring salary or creating seniority levels or creating skills or work activities or things like that, that is like stuff that we need to do. And the data itself is just raw free text. So there's so much that we have to do to get that in a nice, neat tabular data set that can be embedded into a traditional analytics workflow. So
Yeah.
we have like a pretty intensive data pipeline,
Hmm.
but it's really at its core about, you know, making it nice and neat for
Yeah.
the end user. Like it's just about solving problems
Yeah.
that exist in the raw data. And we have solved more of those problems that are probably useful to everybody. So I think it does kind of make sense to to think of like, I don't know, for whatever reason, I'm thinking of like an oil pipeline. You know, you could have like crude oil, but like it's not actually useful for anything. And then like you need this enrichment layer before you actually do anything with it.
You've talked about the vision behind Bloomberg Terminal for labor market data. Bloomberg became Bloomberg because it had data nobody else had, delivered in a way that people depended on. What's Revelio's thing?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know that I necessarily agree that Bloomberg had data that no one else had. I mean, like it actually, you know, in terms of the raw data, like it's out there, it's in Edgar filings, like FactSet has it, Refinitiv has it, like it's kind of out there and it's publicly filed data. Now, I'm sure they've moved into some proprietary stuff. Like now they get like trade flows and stuff. But when they started, I think it's really just like, they were digitizing data that wasn't easy to access. And I feel like we're kind of doing the same thing. Like there's data out there that, people can, anyone can like buy raw data. It's so messy, it's so complicated. So I think, there's so many problems to solve. Like we are on like version God knows what of like company mapping. And like, and I think there are others who are trying to enrich it. And I think, maybe it won't always stay this way, but like for now, we're ahead. We've cleaned that, curated it in ways that others have not, and we are able to uncover insights that are unique. So I think we feel like there's a technical advantage,
Hmm.
and if others do that, great. Then we'll solve the next problem. And you
Yeah.
know, I don't really see a world where we kind of run out of problems to solve.
That makes sense. I wanted to chat a little bit more about the workforce data space. It's getting a little crowded. LinkedIn, like we were saying, has talent insights. There's Lightcast, Running Glass. Someone could argue that you're all fishing from the same pond. What's the honest answer to why Revelio other over others?
Yeah. It's funny, like, when I first started this, I thought, like, "All right, there's two problems." Like, one is, like, "Can this be done?" And another is, like, "Is it defensible?" And I thought, like, there's a really I'm very concerned on how defensible it is, but I'm sure it can be done. Now that's sort of flipped, and now I'm, like, really not concerned about how defensible it is, and I'm much more concerned about whether it's even possible. So, when we first started, we had a different set of competitors. I mean, you mentioned Burning Glass. That's not around anymore. There was ThinkNum, there was Cognizant. Like those were our competitors. None of them are around anymore. LinkedIn Talent Insights. LinkedIn shut down the Talent Insights. They let go of their team. Like that's shutting down.
How are you staying? If everyone's leaving, can you tell me how
Yeah,
you stay?
it's a war of attrition, it's who's the last one standing. I think like we've been lucky enough to kind of stay standing and keep growing. And I think we made a choice that was kind of unique in the space to focus on company as the unit of analysis.
Mhm.
Whereas companies like Lightcast, Talent Neuron, Drop, they have focused more on the market as a unit of analysis. You know, labor market insights. And us, like, we don't really use the term labor market intelligence. We use workforce intelligence because, we feel like, you could have a workforce of a company, but you can't really have the labor market of a company. Like that's not a coherent idea. So I think we kind of started with a little bit of the harder problem. And I don't know. I mean, again, like I'm biased to take it with a grain of salt, but I actually don't think it's a very competitive space. Like I actually feel like the there's, like, more, like, legacy software out there that, like, clients aren't terribly thrilled with, and I feel like
Mhm.
it's a little bit wide open. I mean, I honestly hope there will be more entrants into this market because I do feel like there's a lot to do.
You want competitors.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think it's actually easier. I mean, as an example, we sell into like the US and Europe. We also sell into Latin America. And you would know better, but like in Latin America, there's nothing like this. And it's exciting because, we're introducing this idea to a set of markets that really don't have anything even remotely similar.
Yeah,
But it's harder to do that. Like, I
it
wish
is.
that we weren't the first ones. I wish we were the second, third, fourth, and, people kind of got it. I think it's not always good to be the early adopter,
Mhm.
but, like, whatever, there's pros and cons to that.
Yeah, no, a very, very interesting intake on, when you have competitors, it's easier to explain the product. It's easier to sell the product. You can have a different pitch, a better pitch, and then you sell it. So it's like really teaching people how to use it. But now jumping into, who's really buying the products and why. So you started with hedge funds, which is a fascinating go-to-market move. Tell me about that. Why did investors want workforce data before HR teams did?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think, like right now, our biggest market is corporate HR, even though our earliest market was investment management. I think the advantage to starting in investment management is that the sales process is very easy, and the engineering process is really, really hard. Like, yeah, here's kind of what I mean by that. Like, hedge funds are really very particular on data quality. They hold data quality to an extremely high standard.
As they should.
As they should, yeah. Well, I mean, I think everyone should, but, like, they do it the most. But the actual sales process, you meet someone at a conference, you tell them the data, they ask some questions like, "Oh, does it have a lot of history? Does it have broad coverage? What's the frequency?" And, like, they check some boxes, and if it checks their boxes, they'll say, "Great, we'll trial it." The deal kind of closes itself. That's all you need to do. So you don't really need a sales team in this space.
I wanted to ask you, so how many salespeople do you have and how many data engineers do you have?
Oh, yeah, I would say, like, 2 years ago, we had 1 salesperson and, like, 50 people who were writing code. Now, we've got 12 salespeople
Mhm.
and, like, maybe 65 people who write code. So, we're
Better.
getting we're getting more balanced, I guess. I mean, but really because in the corporate HR market, it's very different. Like, they're not as particular on data quality, but, like, you really need to know what they're working on. You need to know how they want to buy it. Like there's a lot of like solutions development, I would say. So that is more intensive on the sales account management side. And on the data quality side, I feel like we don't really have that much to do because we already did it.
Mhm. That's a better ratio, right? 12 to 60 than 1 to 40 or 50. So I'm sure that they're more in synergy now that there's this better ratios. But thanks for
Yeah.
sharing it with me. Now you just gave me an HR HR data.
Yeah,
That's
no,
very
that's what we do. Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate it. But okay, cool. You mentioned that Revelio has produced its own version of jobs data and that it came out before BLS and moved markets when BLS itself was in turmoil. That's pretty extraordinary. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, it was a little wild. Basically, yeah, I forget the month. I wanna say October maybe, but there was one Jobs Friday. There was a very unflattering jobs report. There were big downward revisions, and the president fired the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Erica McIntyre. So as soon as she got fired, there was a lot of concern that the BLS would become politicized, and we wouldn't be able to trust the jobs numbers, and they would be cast into doubt, or maybe would provide some incentive, like hey, like if the numbers are bad, you're fired. So it got the whole economics community very scared. And that was on a Friday. And then on that Sunday, I called our chief economist, Lisa Simon, and I was like, I think we have to do our own Jobs Friday release. And she was like, I was thinking the same thing. And then like we call our chief data scientist and like, we're like, we got to do this. And he was like, that's what I was thinking too. Like we were all thinking the same thing. It just like had to happen. It really felt like we had no choice because we knew we could do it. We've been providing micro level data for so long, and aggregating to macro statistics should be not that hard. Turns out it was a lot harder than we thought, but like we pulled it off. Like it was a really, we had to work the for that month to get data that would represent the macro statistics.
Yeah. I really love that. Sorry to interrupt you, but I really love that you said that, on Friday this happened and then on Sunday you called, your colleagues, team members, and then everyone was thinking the same thing. I feel like in an organization that has to be the goal. everyone being on the same page and, constructing and building things together, it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it really felt like a nice moment. I mean, it was a very intense month.
Yes.
Like it was, like it only, cost us our sanity to some degree. But but it felt like we were all driving toward the same thing. And actually, the timing really couldn't have been better for us because the next
Okay.
month, the government shut down. And it was the longest government shutdown in history, and there was no jobs data, like from the BLS. So we were kind of the only game in town. And so, it was, we didn't like sell this. This was something we just put out as a public service. But, we got a lot of attention from it. And actually, I mean, this isn't something we like formally announced yet, but heard it here first that we're planning on expanding that to more geographies. The next big goal is we want to kind of globalize Jobs Friday. We want to expand to more countries so you can make comparisons between countries. And then if there's some policy change, then you can analyze the effect of that policy change because you have a comparison group. So it just seems like a much more useful way to get jobs data out there. And we have enough validation that it works really well.
Congrats on the, upcoming release of
Well, not
the
yet. Yeah, but thank you for the
upcoming.
advance.
Yes, but, we hire a lot of offshore talent at all the groups. The group is Data Sharp, and then we have companies under the group. We hire offshore talent for, pretty much every single company.
That's interesting that you guys I mean, that I think what you're describing is very similar to what talent intelligence organizations do within companies, and that's such a big booming subset of HR
It
because
is.
they're so forward thinking on using external data for their talent acquisition strategy.
I wanted to, ask you about people analytics. It has a reputation in HR and it circles as a nice to have that pay lip service to. Doesn't really fund. Do you think that's changing, or are most HR departments still not ready to treat their workforce like a data problem?
There are things that I really love about the people analytics space. And the thing that I love about it is the people. Like the people who work in people analytics are so ambitious and forward thinking and really, really just, they're interesting. The thing that I don't like about it is that I mean, I don't think you could really blame them, but what ends up happening with people analytics teams is that they are essentially the owners of all like talent management data. So if you think of, HR, forget like compliance HR, like analytical HR, you could split that into talent management and talent acquisition. People analytics is really focused on the talent management side. It's like once employees are already there, how's like, engagement and attrition and promotion, and, all that. So that's, they kind of own the talent management data. And because they are the keepers of that data, they get asked for a lot of ad hoc reports. And, they're trying to move into more self-reported things. They're really trying to escape that trap of just like being bombarded with like ad hoc queries. But I think what that has led to is that they are reticent to take on new data sets. Because then they think, if I take on this other data set, then I'm going to be this expert in this other data set, and I'm going to get even more random questions. So it's like, I think they're in a tough spot. Like I'm sympathetic to where they are. Now, in contrast, I think talent intelligence is, you could think of it as the analog. Like people analytics is to talent management, as talent intelligence is to talent acquisition. They are the analytical engine that drives TA for the most part. I mean, that's like maybe a little bit of a simplistic way to think about it, but I think it's like true enough. But I also think the borders between these groups are becoming less important. So I don't know. I think every company faces different like identity crises about like who does what, but I'm hopeful that they're going to produce more impactful work, which will make them be seen as more valuable and eventually get more resources, et cetera. And then there's going to be this like virtuous cycle.
Yeah. And I think that most companies and people analytics teams, HR teams, they rely a lot on internal data. Let's suppose a company that's been around for 30 years, they have, they're using their ATS, it has integrated the data from all past employees, roles and things like that. But that's internal data. What about the external data? What about the comparison? What's going on out there? Are people being paid what they should be paid? What's the salary benchmarking being done? What about these role? Is this like a relevant role still? Internally, you can look at that and, not make such an informed decision as you would if you had the external part. So that makes sense. And that's another interesting point here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Michael Porter, who's like considered the father of modern strategy, has said that strategy at its core is about differentiation. Full stop. Like, what is strategy standing on one foot? It's differentiation. And that like requires benchmarking, which requires standardization, like all these kind of hard things. So I think without considering what's happening with competitors, how we think about differentiation, you sort of are condemned to be non-strategic, almost by definition. So that's a big issue. I think there's also a kind of, old school mindset that, if you are, owning a certain data set, you need to have kind of exact numbers. I think and so even like getting at estimates, anything like crowdsourced, anything sampled is like seen with some skepticism. I think that is, being seen increasingly as like too limiting. And it's even more dangerous because what you had mentioned, what people in HR are analyzing their ATS, their HRIS, that is, they see that as like the internal data. But it's worse than that. That's actually only a portion of their internal data because usually that only includes their W-2 employees and it doesn't include their contingent workers, their contractors. And as you know, someone who hires internationally, sometimes people need to be classified as contractors, basically just as a legal loophole.
Yes.
But for all intents and purposes, they're part of the team. They're part of the workforce.
And
So,
they're not on the ATS.
and they're not in the ATS, they're not in the HRIS. They are in some like procurement database or something. And that is usually almost always that gets ignored. So, if you want to analyze the total workforce, which is almost always the most relevant thing to analyze,
Mhm.
people analytics teams can't really do it or don't really do it, which is a problem.
But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about bets and things that you're doing in the future. So, what is your big bet for the next 3 years in terms of where workforce intelligence goes and what Revelio's role in that is?
Okay, big question. What's the big bet? I don't know that there's like a singular big bet, but here are a few things that I'd say we're
Mini
thinking
bets.
about and working on. One is like I mentioned, globalizing Jobs Friday. That's a big thing for us. Another is doing more scenario planning. So doing a little bit more causal analysis of like if you do a certain thing, if you make a certain investment, what are the downstream effects of that so that you can analyze like is this a good decision? What are the results from a certain decision? And that can be done like for public sectors, like if I make a $10 million investment in some industry, like what does that lead to? Or even for a company, like if I mandate that everyone returns to office, like what's going to happen. So I think scenario planning is really interesting. And I think we are always interested in getting more internal data. So unifying internal and external data is always very exciting for us. We're starting to do that, but I think that probably means we are going to need to have like a sort of analytics platform that like unifies internal and external data so that you can see the whole everything you'd want for an organization. There's another thing that we're thinking about, which is actually getting into like the job board career planning space and providing this information to individuals because we have so much data on like if you take this job what does it lead to and like how much do people get paid and like there's so much information that I think would be useful for individual job seekers or employees thinking about their next move and it seems like there's so much value that we're just sitting on. So yeah, so we're starting to experiment with how to make more consumer applications.
It just made me think about how role progression is so rigid. When people don't think at the other ways that a role can lead to another, or what could the other roles be. So that was turned a light bulb in my head right away. But thank you for sharing with me a little bit more about what you're planning to do in the next few months and years.
Yeah, don't hold me to it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but I'll keep you posted.
yeah. And Last question for you. If you could fix one thing about how companies use data today, whether that's workforce data, market data, any kind, what would it be?
One way that I think about jobs data in particular is that if we are thinking about, the transformation of a workforce, sometimes that happens between jobs. Sometimes, you can move jobs, expand the number of jobs, whatever. But more often that happens within jobs. So very often, like the job itself transforms. So you're a perfect example. You got, hired to do, you know, HR stuff, and now you're hosting a podcast. You are doing something that was not in the job description when you started. But, you had this, it's like what you said. Sometimes the business needs something and everyone knows that that is the direction to move in, and you adapt. And I think so I think that kind of leads me to a couple conclusions. One is that like organizations really need to have an understanding of the tasks and activities of employees rather than just the occupation, because an occupation is really a shorthand for a bundle of activities.
Oh, yeah.
And so once they do that, then I think I think we need to think about management. So here's a take that I'll put out there, which is also another like standing on one foot thing. I think management at its core, at its essence, is about job reconfiguration. So here's what I mean by that. Like if you are a manager, let's say a middle manager, there's some organizational objectives that are fluid, that change all the time.
Hmm.
And there's some set of employees that are also fluid. So there's like business things that like change the requirements of what your team needs to be doing. And then there's changes on the team. Let's say someone leaves. Someone's got to pick up their work, or you realize, someone's actually really good at something you didn't think they were good at, and you want them to do more of something else. And you kind of want to like manage that team.
That is a very interesting point, and I really love that you said that like sometimes the company will come up with a project and then, who's going to take over? And roles change all the time, new tasks get implemented all the time. And yeah, there's a lot to be documented and put in process that sometimes isn't, right? And then it gets to the end of the year and then you're like, "Oh, that wasn't documented. There was no data behind that." And then now I'm gonna have to pick up from where I left. Do you have anything you want to say, compliment to our talk today?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, this was so fun. Thanks for having me. I mean, yeah, I would say to any listeners, like, stay in touch. I post a lot on LinkedIn and stuff like that. Like, all this stuff, it's changing quickly and it's always interesting. So, I think the space is interesting. So, watch this
So do
space.
I.
That's my advice.
So do I. Yeah, no, I agree. Revelio Labs is something important and I'm excited to see where it goes. So yeah, we'll definitely, keep you there on our socials and everyone should do the same. And thank you so much again. It was a total pleasure. And thank you for everyone listening. You'll find much more about this episode on our LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify. Thank you.